back to the Peace Offering podcast. In our run up to our Remineralize and Heal Your Gut Summit, January 19th through 21st of 2024, we're going to be rolling out a series of interviews here on the blog, talking to some of the panelists and guests that will be part of that summit, but also others just to give us a general background on mineralization, gut health, and how these things connect together for high energy states. So we're starting with repeat guest Morley Robbins. And in this interview is a bit more specific about the minerals and how to test for them than our first one. So if you haven't watched the first one, definitely go back and see that first. See that first if you can, because you'll get more of a macro view of these minerals and their dynamics together. If you're just going to jump in with us on this one, you should know Morley Robbins is the creator of the Root Cause Protocol, which is a healing system that he has developed. He's also the author of Cure Your Fatigue and the founder of the Magnesium Advocacy Group. Morley will be joining us at the summit, so for 2 lectures, which is pretty fantastic. He's always a wealth of knowledge, extremely kind, and so much fun to talk to. I hope you enjoy this interview. Well, I firstly, really appreciate you wanting to do more of these talks. And what I always sense in you, whether we're talking or I'm listening to you on another podcast talking, is your sincere desire to get people to understand these concepts and the relationships between iron, copper, magnesium, and sort of the mineral kingdom at large, and how it interfaces with not just the human body, but the soil, and with the plant kingdom, and all the way up the food chain, or all the way down, however you want to look at it.
Right.
In a way, it's alchemy. It's like old school alchemy, and I can sense you're also sort of channeling to some extent the Egyptian alchemists, also with your right in the background. So anyways, thanks again for coming back on to talk with us.
Absolutely.
Where for those of you that maybe are watching this for the first time, I would encourage you to go back and watch our first interview with Morley that we did a little while ago, so you can find that on our YouTube channel or on our blog. What I'd like to do this time is get into more detail about iron and understanding iron panels, and to look at some of the blood markers that you ask people to get when doing Root Cause Protocol, sort of the full Monty panel, whatnot. And where we sort of had an informal conversation not long ago about there's widespread misunderstanding of ferritin, and which is sort of like one category of understanding, but then ferritin, most people understand, is the blood marker ferritin, which is something different. And most of people's understanding of iron revolves around ferritin status. So can you tell us a little bit about ferritin?
Well, I renamed it. I call it Ferritin because so many mistakes are made interpreting it. I think everything changed in 1972 with the article by Jacobs et al. In British Medical Journal talking about serum ferritin. Oh, wow, here's an important marker. For 100 years before that, everyone used hemoglobin as the primary marker. And what's hemoglobin? It's what's in circulation. And everything flipped to, oh, we're supposed to obsess with what's in storage. And right out of the blocks, people should stop and say, wait a minute. Do we really want to be measuring stored iron, or do we want to be measuring what's moving around the body? And when you understand how reactive it is, how violently reactive it is, better to focus on optimizing circulatory iron and minimizing stored iron. Stored iron is not your friend. It's like trying to store nitroglycerin bottles. Like, oh, that's got to be really careful, right? And so we've been corralled into thinking that there's no problem. And
So you were telling, I've heard you mention this on a few podcasts, but you
right,
mentioned that there's three types of
right,
ferritin. Okay,
right.
so like that is the starting point, is probably new information for most people.
Yeah. And so for the gearheads, what you want to do is look up the article by Harrison and Orozio. It's called the ferret. It's about 35 pages long, and it'll keep you occupied for a good probably 2 weeks. But in any event, at the macro level, which is what you're looking for, we have three types of ferritin. We have heavy chain, light chain, and secreted, and they're not the same. The heavy chain is principally expressed in the heart and kidney. And what what heavy chain is, the heavy refers to heavy metal, has copper, which is a heavy metal. And what's critically important for the heavy chain ferritin is it has the ability to express the ferroxidase enzyme function, which is one of the most important enzyme functions that copper does on this planet. But it basically turns ferritin into an ATM machine. Put iron in, take it out. Put in, take it out. And anytime you're moving iron, you've got to be able to do it so that it doesn't create oxidative stress. So it doesn't create a Fenton reaction. John Fenton, 1895, Cambridge University, discovers, oh, this iron thing is really dangerous inside the biological body of a human. Thank you, Dr. Fenton. And
A while ago.
a while ago. But the key is understanding that the heavy chain form is different than the light chain form. And so the light chain does not have a heavy metal in it. The light chain relies on hydrogen peroxide to put the iron into storage. Well, iron and hydrogen peroxide is not without issue. And so the light chain is found principally in the spleen and the liver. Now, the thing is, when we get into these types of discussions, the expression of heavy and light, it's actually a spectrum. But for our purposes right now, we're just polarizing the discussion. I don't want, there are people that are way more talented than I am. And if they happen upon this, I want them to know that I know that I'm using shortcuts. But for our purposes, this is very, very helpful. And so again, liver and spleen, and everything changed in 1928 when two separate scientific teams, one at the University of Wisconsin, the other at the University of Kentucky, March and May of 1928, they withheld copper from the diet of rodents and then measured the amount of iron accumulation in the liver of those rodents. It's an absolute biological fact. If copper is missing in the diet, iron will rise in the liver. Now looking back on that research, they're silent about the spleen. I would suspect that the spleen is filling up with iron as well. Don't have proof of that, but those studies were done in 1928, and then in 2021, Kim and Gonzalez did a follow-up study because they wanted to look at this dynamic genetically, and they were looking at 13 different genes, some that relate to copper, some that relate to iron, some that relate to zinc. And they wanted to see, of those 13 genes, which, if any, which are upregulated in the presence of copper deficiency. And only one gene fired up, and that was the ferritin light chain, FTL gene. And so they have genetic proof that low copper diet causes the gene to upregulate, which is causing the increased expression of the protein to absorb and take on all this iron. That's a big deal. I mean, it's only instance where I know where they knew back in the day what was going on, but they were able to prove it in the modern era with genetics. I'm sure there are others, but that's just one that I'm aware of. So everything's hunky dory. Just to know those two different forms of ferritin is a big deal, and it's very likely that your doctor doesn't even know that. They don't know that there's a heavy and a light. But then we have the third form, and it's called secreted ferritin. And what you've got, let's back up a step. There's three principal activities that need to take place to restore our blood all day long. Our body's constantly replacing blood. And so we're birthing 2.5 million red blood cells in the long bones, the bone marrow of our long bones, the eye bone, the hip, the pelvic bone. It's very rich in bone marrow, and it has what are called central nurse cells. They got a little cross. No, they don't. But thinking of my sister who she was a nurse, and she's very proud of her pin. But the budding red blood cells, they're called progenitor erythroid cells. They're literally nursing on the perimeter of these nerve cells. And then after a couple of days, they go to the hepatocytes. That's the liveriest of the liver cells. And they go there to mature. And there's several things that happen when they mature. They've got to offload some of the iron. They've got to make energy, got to make ATP while they still have a mitochondria inside them, because they need that fullest expression to create the right conformation of the cell. And it's like an inner tube. And that requires both iron release and energy production. And then once that's done, the organelles inside the red blood cell get jettisoned out. It's absolutely fascinating. And then it goes into circulation. And it's supposed to live for 120 days. That's the lifespan of a red blood cell, assuming everything's hunky-dory. Let's just assume everything's hunky-dory. And so then the third phase is, so we're making them, we're maturing them, then we got to recycle them. And the red blood cells are coursing through the spleen at an outrageous rate. But the spleen has to pick out every second 2.5 million red blood cells, same number as the bone marrow is making them. They're being picked off in the spleen because they don't have the right flexibility. The technical term is deformability, which is an awkward way of saying flexibility. And if the red blood cells can't get through the sinuses of the spleen, they get sent to what are called red pulp macrophages. Those are the Pac-Men inside the spleen. And the breakdown of the red blood cell causes a release of the ferritin. But ideally, what the macrophage wants to do is download the iron, get it to transferrin, and get it back to the bone marrow. But if that doesn't happen efficiently or properly, what happens is, and this is happening inside the lysosome of the macrophage. This is, you wanted a gearhead response. I'm giving you the gearhead response. But the stomach of the macrophage, if it can't properly break down the ferritin protein, it's going to cleave about 10 amino acids off. The iron is going to be discharged into either ferritin inside the macrophage or hemosiderin, and we'll come back to that. And then that ferritin, that abridged, that amended ferritin, gets released into the bloodstream. And there's differing opinions about what the levels should be inside the body. And my conversation with Douglas Kell a number of years ago, world-renowned iron expert, he said it should be 0. And what you'll find from a lot of practitioners is they like to see it around 100. And so when Dr. Kell told me that there's no, that rising ferritin in the blood is not a sign of iron vitality, it's a sign of organ pathophysiology. What the practitioners who are recommending 80 to 100 are saying is, let's get you making bad blood. Let's get the ferritin up to 80 to 100. And believe it or not, there are medications that are designed for that level of iron, which is just, I think it's absolutely insane. So thyroid meds are designed for a ferritin of 80. It's like, we don't have enough knowledge, Jonathan, to understand why they do it that way. But to me, it violates all the principles of Mother Nature. We were not designed to have rising ferritin in our blood. And that's a modern phenomenon that really began in the 1940s, 41, and then really took off in 72 with the Jacobs et al., and then has become hyperbolic with the level of iron fortification, iron supplementation, iron infusions that are being done worldwide, especially for pregnant women, infants, and seniors. It is out of control. And in large part, it stems from the fact that there's a complete misunderstanding of what low iron in the blood test means. And low iron in the blood means there's high iron in the tissue and it's stuck. And why is it stuck? Because it can't be properly recycled in the spleen, can't get released, can't get to transferrin to get back to the bone marrow. And it's absolutely fascinating when you really begin to study, especially the spleen. It's absolutely, I mean, you've got the intersection of two major activities, iron recycling with the immune system, and we're going at blitzkrieg speed. And what's coming to light is the number of conditions that are a result of dysfunction in the spleen. And they've known that the spleen was an issue back in the Middle Ages. They knew about depression, melancholy, but the black bile that was supposedly either stored there or originated there has been known about for hundreds of years, but it's been tucked away and swept under the rug now, and we're not supposed to think about the spleen as a critical component of this process. So the ferritin protein has gone from obscurity, where no one knew about it, and now it's front and center, and it should make everyone nervous to just be preoccupied with that storage protein, because it only represents about 10% of iron inside the cell. 70% of iron is in the hemoglobin, which is in circulation. Another 10% is in myoglobin, which has similar properties to hemoglobin. So we've got 80% is this bolus of iron in our body, carrying oxygen, holding oxygen, making it available. 10% is stored. And then we have 1% is what's called serum iron. And that is the iron that is actually in the recycling program, in this 2.5 million red blood cells a second. And what's difficult is to really get your head around the numbers. 2.5 million times a second. We've been talking now for about 15 minutes, times 60, times 2.5 million. And we don't, out of sight, out of mind. Well, of course my body's going to do it. And what the average person does not know, what the average practitioner does not know, is that you cannot make heme without copper. You cannot make hemoglobin without copper. You cannot make a red blood cell without copper. You cannot mature a red blood cell without copper, and you cannot recycle a red blood cell without copper. Now, if those facts were known, I think we'd have a different perception of the importance of ferritin, but because all of the prevailing mindset is iron regulates itself. And that's what dominates people's thinking. And it is a false narrative. It is completely false. Copper's the general, iron's the foot soldier. And the faster people can adopt that stratified thinking, that even though there's fewer numbers of generals, they're really important. And they're keeping track of all of these foot soldiers down here. And it's a completely different sense of order of magnitude than we have in the conventional thought process.
Yeah, well, you just gave us a lot to process, and if you heard that for the very first time in your life, then it might take a few more listens.
Yeah, and again, the goal here is not to overwhelm people. You wanted me to give you an answer.
Yes,
I
yeah,
gave it to
no,
you.
yeah, I am, because I have a lot of questions based on what you
That's
just
great.
said, because there was so much.
That's fine.
So I think firstly, you are the research that you're citing is done at the research level, and I think part of the issue is that they're using testing methodologies that are research level. They're not using commercial labs to do this testing, and commercial labs can't test all three of these types of ferritin that you just, or the
Right.
gradient of ferritin that you
That's
even
right.
alluded to before. And so you get an even lower resolution picture when you start to look at commercial labs values of iron
Very good point.
status. So
No,
we've just significantly down regulated the definition of the picture by using a commercial lab. Okay, so that's what a clinician is using. That's the best tool that they have. So when ferritin is measured in the blood, which type of ferritin is it?
it's the secreted ferritin.
Okay,
That's the only form that they can actually measure in the blood test. They can't measure the ferritin that's in the cell because the blood doesn't go into the cell. It's outside of the cell. So blood is extracellular, and so it's only the secreted form that's there, that's being measured.
And I recall you saying that that type of ferritin has little or no iron in it.
Yes, the phrase I use is they're empty shotgun shells, but Dr. Orozio, people at that stature, Dr. Jacobs has articles where they talk about little to no iron in the protein.
Okay, so not only is ferritin representing only 10% of the total iron supply, the measured amount in a commercial lab is almost insignificant when it comes to iron status. It's almost insignificant.
And what the research will tell us is that there's a correlation between the secreted ferritin in the blood and the stored ferritin in the body. And I'm like, I'm not buying that. And they can do all the studies they want, but until they go into the cell to measure it and then contrast it with it, again, if people knew how much of our understanding of the body is based on a story, I think they'd be shocked. It's
Yeah,
all there.
and you've made the point before that the only way to really know what's going on in the tissue level is to do like a liver biopsy, or there in some cases you can do an MRI or a CAT CT of the liver, and you can do a liver assessment, liver iron concentration assessment based on that. And I have a couple papers that I have here on the side that we could potentially look at, but that is sort of the best way at the research level that one could do it. And okay, so zooming out, where many people are basing their iron status on their blood ferritin levels, which is a sort of a false lead. You can't get an accurate measure. And if 70% of your,
it's not complete. Right.
yeah, and if 70% of your iron is in the hemoglobin, that in which used to be the standard for looking at iron status pre 1972, that should be the first stage. And I do believe that if you go get a blood donation, that is the threshold metric that they're looking at, that you need to
Absolutely.
have hemoglobin. So they're not testing your ferritin on the spot, they're testing your hemoglobin. And for
Absolutely.
good reason, because they don't want to kill anybody. So if so that's like number one. Everybody should be looking at that, and that's super easy to get because that's in a comprehensive blood count. That's in a CBC, so you can get that and look at that number, and you like it to be where for women and men.
Um, Hemoglobin should be between 12 and a half and 13 and a half for a woman, 14 and a half and 15 and a half for a man. Those are accepted ranges for the sexes. And people just need to know they're really where we have three forms of ferritin, we have three accepted forms of iron that can be measured in the blood. So ferritin is one. We're now talking about hemoglobin. And then the third, which we'll probably talk about, is called serum iron. Sometimes it's called total iron. Sometimes it's just called iron. So just so people know that there are these three different containers of iron that are measured in the blood test.
Right, in the blood test. And as you've
Blood
talked about before, that on the research level, there are other storage forms areas, but we can't
test.
really test for them. So they're, for our
Right.
conversation, for practical purposes, they're not relevant. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about serum iron. And I've heard you say that for a man, an ideal value is 120. For a woman, it's 100. And I'm assuming when you're saying woman, you're talking about a cycling woman, not a postmenopausal woman.
Even a post, that's a good point. Very, very rarely will they draw a distinction between a postmenopausal woman and a man, but and obviously women take on more iron as they stop cycling. I still use 100 for women just because women are designed to shed blood and shed iron, men are not. And so we have a propensity to take on more iron in our frame as a result.
Got it. And so above that value and below that value would indicate two different situations. Can you explain what those would be?
Right. More often than not, you'll find people are below their ideal value. And what that represents is an inefficiency in the iron recycling system. And again, people, the part that's missing in our consciousness is that there is this constant recycling system every second of every day. And that the amount of iron that's being released in the spleen, that's got to get back to the bone marrow. Back up. So in the course of 24 hours, we're going to replace 2 trillion red blood cells. Big number. But the amount of iron that's needed to support that, it's a very small amount. So they'll tell you that we have about 5,000 milligrams of iron in our body. It's like 5 capsules. A capsule is 1,000 milligrams. So we have 5 capsules of iron in our body. And in the course of 24 hours, we need 25 milligrams of iron to replace 2 trillion red blood cells. 25 milligrams to replace 2 trillion red blood cells. Ridiculous contrast, especially when you put 25 milligrams in the context of 5,000. Very small amount. But so that's a surprise to hear that. What will shock you is to find out that 24 of the 25 milligrams that are needed each and every day come from this recycling system, courtesy of copper at the back door. It's called ferritin, that releases the serum iron that we're talking about. It's been broken down in the stomach of the macrophage, and it's been it presents at the ferritin doorway, iron portin doorway, the iron doorway, and the doorman is a copper doorman. The ceruloplasmin protein hangs out there and makes sure that the iron gets out and gets attached to transferrin. When copper is present, that process happens 2.5 times faster. That's the work of Paul Fox at Cleveland Clinic. Major discovery about the role that ceruloplasmin plays in iron recycling. So we have this critical need for bioavailable copper at the doorway. We have this critical need for copper to get 95% of the iron, 24 out of 25 milligrams. So 95% of the iron is coming by way of the action of copper. And it's not just letting the iron out, it's making sure that it gets attached to transferrin, which is the transport protein that takes it back to the bone marrow. So the serum iron represents a small, it's about 1% of the iron in the body. So I call it the thimble. Ferritin is the teacup and hemoglobin is the bucket. But the thimble of iron is a very important 1% because it reveals how efficiently, how close to the 100 for the woman, 120 for the man, how close are we? And if we're below that, then we've got some static in the system. Either there's not enough Dorman, we're not getting connected properly. Somewhere there's a glitch in the system, and that's more often the case when serum iron is low. When it's elevated, the only research that I found that really speaks to that, Jonathan, is out of China, and it relates to increased uric acid, which is relating to increased inefficiency of the mitochondria. And there seems to be a propensity when uric acid is rising that there's going to be greater levels of serum iron. I don't fully understand what the metabolic reason is. It's just 95% of the time people will be below their threshold than be above their threshold.
I was hoping you wouldn't bring up uric acid at this point in the conversation because I want to talk to you about it, but now I can't not. And that is after listening to you talk to Paul about Rick Johnson's work, and there's obviously differing opinions on fructose, and like I'm just going to put a pin in that for a second, and then tell you I was listening to another podcast where the host was talking about the iron chelating properties of uric acid, and it that struck me as like, and it kind of made me pause for a second. And the last blood work I did, which was maybe a month ago, my uric acid had elevated over its norm, and my serum iron was elevated above its norm.
Interesting.
And I thought, well, I got to look down this rabbit hole. And I found many studies that were mostly in rheumatology that were, they were essentially saying that they believe now that gout is not caused by uric acid, but it is caused by iron deposition in the joint. And that uric acid is attracted to that because it's acting as an antioxidant and an iron chelator. And so that it is following, that uric acid is following iron levels rather than the other way around. And
I can see that. That makes sense.
And then, just to add on to that, I also found a number of studies that had to do with uric acid also acting as an electron donor, an antioxidant, to quell neurodegeneration, that it was helping to have an antioxidant effect in the central nervous system for neurons, which was also really interesting. And so my take from all of that, considering Rick Johnson's work and Perlmutter and Robert Lustig, is that clearly we don't understand uric acid, and that it's a multifactorial chemical that is being impacted by many different contexts and many different, including fructose, but also purines and other factors, including iron. So I thought that was really interesting.
Well, I think what's important for folks to understand is that uric acid in the blood acts as an antioxidant. And a very important article written, I think it was in 1982 by Bruce Ames to that effect. Very, very good article. Uric acid inside the cell, building uric acid inside the cell, is a pro-oxidant. So again, we have to understand what's the environment that we're using.
Yeah.
One of the things that we learned, I think I may have mentioned that I was at a meeting in Florida, and Rick Johnson was there, and he was chatting with a few of us afterwards. And he was telling us about the depending upon who's funding the study, when do you measure uric acid? If you want to make uric acid out to be the bad guy, you do your uric acid assessment in the morning, because apparently it builds up overnight. But if you want to level the playing field, you'll measure it during the course of the day after the body's had a chance to kind of get its mojo. So there's little tricks of the trade that are not in typical studies. But the other thing that people need to know is that uric acid represents billowing black smoke coming out of the mitochondria. And it as I understand it, it represents a collapse in the mitochondria's ability to make energy. And there's this very steady breakdown from ATP to ADP to AMP to IMP to hypoxanthine to xanthine, and then to uric acid. And all the while, what's the mitochondria doing? It's cleaving phosphates off, trying to get some energy, because it can't recycle. It can't recycle. It can't recycle. Why? Because copper's missing. And so I think there's a lot of confusion around uric acid, because most research scientists and most clinicians don't know what bioavailable copper is. And so I identified 14 areas. Before I flew out to see Dr. Johnson, I identified 14 areas where copper would have mitigated or corrected the uric acid problem. So that's where the
fascinating. Yeah.
That's where the breakdown is. And the ultimate breakdown is uric acid is supposed to be broken down by an enzyme called uricase. It's also called uric acid oxidase. And we're supposed to believe that we lost the ability to do that 60,000 years ago. But Leslie Clave wrote a very important article in 1980 about copper deficiency in uric acid, quoting studies from the 1950s, not 50,000 years ago, 1950s, where uricase was working. So there's more to the story, always more to the story.
Well, so it just backing up a little bit, what, I think a main takeaway for someone who is a biohacker wants to test their serum uric acid is that it has a protective effect in the blood, and you also, it's going to be a proxy for some type of dysfunction that's happening in the mitochondria. So you don't want it to be high, in the sense that you see it high, your body's doing what it can to mitigate a problem. So that's a good thing. But you also need to, you're not going to try to like focus on correcting uric acid. You're going to focus on correcting mitochondrial function.
Exactly.
So that is that I think is the important point for people to look at.
And the point that Rick Johnson made with us that I'd never heard, never seen it in writing, was fascinating. He said a lot of the markers are set at stay below 5. He said, what I found in my research is the animals still get fat between 4 and 5. They're healthy, but they'll get fat. If you want to stay healthy and thin, you want your uric acid around 4. It's like, wow, that was a bombshell. But for people who are worried about heart disease, you definitely want to keep your uric acid below 5. When it gets above 5, especially when it gets to 5.5 or 6, you have full-blown cardiovascular disease. So it's and then the other side of it is, if it gets too low, below 3, then you're dealing with a kidney that's not able to recycle it properly. And so low uric acid is often correlated with neurodegeneration. High uric acid is correlated with heart disease. So those are the bookends for people to know about.
Yeah, great. So getting back to our iron discussion,
Right.
and so here's something that I've just been fixated on for the past couple of months, and I've expressed this to you, and that is transferrin saturation. And
Yep.
and I don't mean TIBC, I mean transferrin saturation, and and so for people that do get the full Monty, or they want to just look at their iron markers, you'll see TIBC, UIBC, serum iron, iron saturation, and then if it's bundled in there, you might see transferrin as a separate marker. And can you explain to people TIBC and transferrin and this whole saturation thing?
Right. Yeah. I'll do my best. The two proteins that represent the first line of defense for the human body are ceruloplasmin and transferrin. They're both proteins. Ceruloplasmin is a beast, 1066. I don't even know how many amino acids transferrin has, but it's infinitely smaller than ceruloplasmin. But those two proteins work hand in glove with each other to keep iron away from pathogens. That's one of their most important. The transferrin is totally devoted to that. Ceruloplasmin, it's one of its many functions. But those two proteins are joined at the hip to keep iron away from pathogens. The synthesis of transferrin is the gene is stimulated by the presence of retinol. The production of ceruloplasmin is stimulated by hypoxia. It's stimulated by a lot of different factors, but hypoxia would be one of the most important. And in the presence of iron, if there's too much iron, it knows it needs to be, increasing its activity. And the copper pumps that the copper pumps that load the copper into ceruloplasmin are activated by retinol. So retinol is playing a really critical point for both gene expression to make transferrin and to make sure that the copper pump that's going to load the copper into ceruloplasmin, that they're working. That's why retinol is so central to the root cause protocol. And it's retinol that makes copper bioavailable. So the numbers for ideal ceruloplasmin should be 30. Not my idea. It's the searing work of 1960, Dr. Sternlieb, and I always get the other doctor, Sternlieb and his colleague, doing their work at Bell Laboratories in upstate New York. I think that's very funny. They were studying human copper proteins at a Bell Laboratory. And, but they honed in on 30 was the threshold level for ideal ceruloplasmin, and 100 for copper. You should have 100 units of copper in your blood test, and the ratio should be 3.33. That's considered ideal. And then transferrin gets reported as a 3-digit number, but the ideal should be 300. But what I do is just move the decimal point over. So ceruloplasmin 30, transferrin 30. When I see that 30-30, I know I've got someone who's really in nice harmony and balance in their body. If I don't see that, what I'm looking for is their parity. If they're both down, are they equally down? If they're both up, are they equally up? And that's useful to know that. Transferrin is basically the docking stations for iron in the blood. TIBC is total iron binding capacity. And it's what's the number of docking stations we've got in the bloodstream that we know we can use. And ideally what they talk about is having iron be occupying 25 to 30% of these docking stations, so that we have room for other metals, aluminum or other factors that are going to bind to the transferrin. And the rule of thumb that I use, Jonathan, is the transferrin number times 12.5 will generally get you pretty close to TIBC, or TIBC divided by 12.5 will get you pretty close to what transferrin is. Because I want to know, not all blood tests will get you transferrin. The full Monty will, but not all blood tests will. They'll usually talk about TIBC. But what you really want to know is transferrin, ceruloplasmin, are they in parity? How's my body handling iron at that primal level? And the percent saturation is taking serum iron divided by TIBC. So the amount of iron, that thimble of iron, divided by all the docking stations to get a percent saturation. And the closer that percent saturation is to 20%, the lower your chance of getting cancer. The closer that percent saturation is to 60%, the greater your chance of getting cancer. Because what it's indicating is that there's just too much saturation of iron in the system. And when they pull the curtain back on cancer, what you'll find is two factors that not many people talk about. It's iron accumulation and retinol deficiency. That's the breeding ground for cancer. And so you want to, the retinol is obviously important for the transferrin, and you want to keep your iron levels at an appropriate level and know that that's really the breeding ground for the cancer activity inside the body.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. That was really insightful. Two questions out of that, but back to your ratio of CP to T. So if you see them at parity but low, can you explain how you read that? If you explain them at parity but high, how you would read that?
Yeah. Again, more often than not, you're going to see it low. So not often it will be high, but occasionally it will be. So when it's low, there would be two factors that might be in play. If transferrin is low, you question how much retinol is in your diet, real animal-based vitamin A, because it's so critically important to fire up the gene to make the protein. Again, for low ceruloplasmin, two factors would stand out. One, is there retinol to fire up the copper pump? The pumps are called ATP7A and ATP7B. They're a really big deal. But those two pumps, 7B loads up ceruloplasmin, 7A loads up all the rest, which is a lot. But the low retinol would mean the pumps aren't getting fired up. And low copper in the diet would suggest that the numbers are going to be down. Now, what you've got with ceruloplasmin is it's an acute phase reactant. So it responds to inflammation, infection. What's it doing? It's got a payload. It's got copper. Copper is the original, I would argue it should be the only, but it's the original antimicrobial element. Our body was designed to use copper. This was done a long time before sovereign silver came along. and sovereign silver is very helpful for people who are copper deserts. But what I chose to do was, let's restore copper and let's not be as preoccupied with the silver. It's just a different approach to restoring the immune function in the body. And so the high ceruloplasmin is a sign of inflammation. And so what happens is that, that copper divided by ceruloplasmin, ideally, should be 3.33. 100 divided by 30, 3.33. If that ratio is below 3.33, we know that there's probably a shortage of copper and retinol in the diet. When that ratio is above, and we've got to think of this ratio as a logarithmic number. It's not mathematical, it's not ordinal, it's logarithmic. So that when someone presents with a 4.33, just like in an earthquake, oh wow, this is 10 times higher than it should be, to get an order of magnitude about what's going on inside the body. Oh, there must be some inflammatory process, liver, spleen, some kidney, somewhere somebody's on fire, and we need to be mindful of that. So when ceruloplasmin rises up, it's responding to a metabolic event called inflammation. Inflammation is not a disease. It's a sign of piss poor energy production. The nuance that, again, there's not a lot of literature about it, and it's more intuitive than research-based. But when transferrin is above 30, when TIBC is well above what it should be, that's when I suspect parasites, because parasites are known to make their own transferrin. And so you have to get into the nuance of what kind of lifestyle does this person have? Have they been traveling? Are they being exposed possibly to pathogens? And more often than not, that intuition is paid off in terms of identifying a pathogenic problem that was corrected by using bioresonance or biomagnetism that didn't require any kind of intervention other than treating the pathogens involved.
Wow.
Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, it does. It makes a lot of sense. And the reason why I brought up transferrin saturation or iron saturation as a more vague measure is because of its ability to signal the liver in some way to produce more SHBG, and its downstream effect that it has on testosterone and even estrogen. And so here's something kind of interesting. I have 3 clients that they're all male, and within they're between 45 and 55, and they all have the same SHBG at about 71. They all have different ferritin levels. I think it's something like 78, 150, 200. They all have good hemoglobin levels at 14, 15. They all have differing serum iron levels. So in one case 76, another case 100, another case 170. Mm-hmm. And so what's interesting to me, if I'm kind of looking at all these things, is like, well, SHBG is not dependent on serum iron alone. It's not dependent on ferritin. It's not dependent on hemoglobin. It is dependent on something else. And when you look at the TSAT, it is dependent upon that, and that there is some kind of signal.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So my point is that it is changing a sex hormone profile based on the amount of saturation of that transferrin protein. And it's seeing that as really important. And I wonder what else is being signaled by that saturation, because that's a big system to change a whole hormonal profile. Says, to change someone's sex hormone profile based on that saturation. That's a big deal. There's a lot of downstream effects that happen. So what else is it signaling? And
well, I think what people need to, again, what we need to do is unravel our consciousness that says that more iron is better. Because the meme that runs medicine in the Western world is you're anemic and you're copper toxic. And that's a lie. It's an absolute inverse of the truth. And so fascinating that it's TSAT that's connected with SHBG. What people may not know is that what makes iron so dangerous is 4 unpaired electrons. And so copper knows that that's a problem. Oxygen knows that that's a problem. Copper is the only element on the planet that can regulate both oxygen and iron at the same time. That's a big deal. And so if what we're not thinking about, what we're not taking stock of, is that rising saturation, there's an energetic frequency that's being sent out as the level of iron is rising in that saturation. It's a frenetic signal, and that frenetic signal must somehow affect SHBG and then downstream factors as well. But we have to think of this energetically, think quantum as opposed to just the substrate itself, because I think there is an energetic field that's created. And when someone's got high percent saturation, they are running hot. Again, too much iron is not your friend. You want it, it's like Goldilocks. You want it just right. And it's copper that's going to keep it just right. It's not iron regulating itself.
Yeah. Another point, I think, to unravel this twisted mythology around iron, I think it's worth noting. You talked a little bit about the recycling system and how crucial that was for maintaining iron status, and if you're going to be making new red blood cells and you're going to be making new heme, you need to be recycling that iron. And it's sort of like the efficiency of that system can determine whether or not someone shows up as anemic in a blood test. And as you mentioned before, it's copper dependent. It's a copper deficiency more than it is iron deficiency. But where I want to go is the typical intervention is to then administer iron. And I think where this stems from, not only for people that have just a little broader understanding of iron, is that hepcidin is involved here, and that you need to absorb more iron. And that's the problem, is like you need to ingest it and then you need to absorb it. And hepcidin is this regulatory hormone that is basically saying, as it increases, it's dampening the amount of absorption, and as it lowers, it's increasing the amount of absorption. And so it totally, even though it's known that this recycling system exists, it's just suddenly discounted. And that operation of like controlling hepcidin becomes the focal point of getting more iron into the system. And that's a huge departure from what you are talking about.
Well, the overwhelming majority of practitioners don't even know what hepcidin is. They've never heard of it. You can bank that. That's a fact. So the average person doesn't know what it is either. And there's a positive regulator for the ferroportin doorway that's critical in iron recycling, the iron doorway, instrumental in recycling. There's a positive regulator called the ferroxidase enzyme function, expressed by ceruloplasmin. And there's a negative regulator called hepcidin. Well, a positive regulator would be our mom, getting us ready for school. A negative regulator would be like a SWAT team. They have different energy about them. And when does hepcidin rise in the body? When there's copper deficiency. Oh, wow, that's interesting. So if copper's down, then that ceruloplasmin thingy must be down. So then we do need this hepcidin. So where does hepcidin come from? From the liver. And it's called the HAMP gene, HAMP, hepatic antimicrobial peptide. Oh, so maybe this is an ancient expression of immune function, that when under certain circumstances copper's down, the body has this backup plan that says, hey, I'm here to help you. What I'm going to do is make sure that the recycling system shuts down. We're going to keep the iron inside the macrophages, so the pathogens can't get it. But there's a downside to that, because there's pathogens on the inside as well as on the outside. So hepcidin is really designed for keeping it away from the extracellular bad guys. It doesn't do anything about the intracellular bad guys, like parasites, things like that. And so the other thing that people need to know is that hepcidin is not blanketly affecting everything. 95% of its focus is on the spleen. I found that in one article, the Shemin 2015. One article talked the truth of what the focus of hepcidin is. Because all these doctors will talk about, yeah, it's going to change the uptake of iron, and it's going to change the release in the liver. No, it's the spleen, folks. And if the spleen is under stress, and what's the mouse model for depression? It's absolutely fascinating. It's called chronic social defeat stress. You and I would call it PTSD. But it's directed at the spleen. Chronic social defeat stress goes right to the spleen. Spleen begins to lose its verve. It starts to wobble with a critical metabolite called NKG2D. NK is natural killer. G is gene, natural killer gene 2D. And when that wobbles, you get depression. And don't you know, Big Pharma's got us covered? And they have this R-ketamine that solves that problem, puts that black tape over that NKG2D, and then we don't have depression anymore. It doesn't correct the problem. It just masks the expression of that metabolite. Like, well, why don't we correct the expression of the metabolite? What's going on in the spleen that it's acting out like that? So that's where I think the breakdown is not having a full understanding of the role of hepcidin, what its focus is, and what are some of the second and third order implications of that. And when the spleen is under stress, it's supposed to weigh 7 ounces. When it's not stressed, it's about 7 ounces. When it gets really stressed, it weighs 7 pounds. Well, there's a big difference between 7 ounces and 7 pounds. There's a 16-fold increase in weight, and that splenomegalia, as it's called, that enlarged spleen, is connected with so many different problems in the body. It's absolutely mind-blowing, but nobody talks about it. It's just like it's behind a curtain, and we're not supposed to peek behind the curtain to see what's going on. And then we're back to the intersection. These functions don't work right if it's 7 pounds. And what's it full of? Granulocytes. What's granulocytes? Another word for neutrophils. What are neutrophils? They're the Marines of the immune system. It means they're fighting some kind of infection, and they're going hyperbolic. Well, what happened? Why did the iron get stuck in the spleen? That's what we need to find out. Not, oh, well, let's go get a drug and try to mask the problem. I think that's where we're at a disadvantage in the modern era, is there's not enough people asking, why is my vitamin D low? Why is my hepcidin expression off? Why is my T saturation elevated? They're not asking the why, because I don't know why. I think that's the question, is why aren't more people asking why? Because that's when it gets really interesting.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. I hope everybody's still with us. I want to circle to some of the other minerals that you look at. You look at zinc in the blood, and I wonder, you seem to have sort of these interesting ways of interpreting values. And so, I mean, is it as straightforward as seeing what your zinc status is, or are you looking at relationships there as well?
Well, you can't help but look at the relationship between zinc and copper, thanks to just the preoccupation that people have with that. Thank you, Carl Pfeiffer, for that. It's just, I don't worship at that. I just look for some kind of parity. But what I'm particularly interested in is I'm looking to see if zinc is looking low. If zinc is looking low, then I'm concerned that there's too much iron in the liver, which is burning up magnesium. And then the liver is using zinc as a surrogate for magnesium because it's got same valence, +2. And that'll fill the bill for some of the enzymes. And when zinc looks suspiciously low, like it's down in the 60s or 70s, even sometimes in the 80s, I'm beginning to suspect there's a stress point in the liver. And I never talk about zinc supplementation. Again, that's conventional mythology. That's not natural wisdom. And so we get zinc from our diet. And what I found is that when people do the root cause protocol, the zinc settles down and gets back to where it's supposed to be, because iron's getting back to where it's supposed to be, because copper's getting back to where it's supposed to be, and that's allowing magnesium to do its thing.
It seems like there's that same depressive mechanism that iron's having on zinc is also having on RBC magnesium. Is that true?
Yes, absolutely true. Yep. Yeah, I mean, for years, when people had low RBC magnesium, I would tell them, "Oh, take more," not knowing that the real problem is there's too much iron in the system. That took years and years to finally tease that out. And so it's just the advantage of the magnesium in the red blood cell is very quickly how stressed the person is. But it isn't just emotional stress. It's iron stress and oxidative stress. And the iron and oxidative stress are sort of hand in glove with each other. And so you just need to be mindful that the body will correct itself. You got to pull that iron footprint, you got to scale it back so it doesn't have such a dominant impact on the body.
You ever find RBC mag high?
In about a handful of clients, over 7. I've never seen it above 7.4. I've spoken to a world-renowned pathologist who I won't name, MD, PhD, did his training at NIH, which means he's really smart. And I asked him, I said, "What does this mean?" He says, "I don't know." And he said, I don't think anyone does know. It's usually tied with some kind of kidney dysfunction. And when the kidneys start to get stressed, start to express different stages of kidney disease, you will have elevated levels of magnesium being excreted. It's not being properly handled in the kidney. But I've never found an article that explains mag RBC that's too high. I've looked for years and I've never come across anything. And if anyone knows one, please send it my way, or send it to Jonathan. He'll get it to me. But I would love to know what the physiological mechanism is that leads to overexpression of magnesium inside the red blood cell. I sent you an article about ceruloplasmin just before we started our conversation. Yeah. And just for grins and giggles, you might want to put that up on the podcast.
Let's see.
Just so people can read, what is this protein really about? And I've read over 100 articles, maybe more, about ceruloplasmin. This is just like 3 or 4 pages long, and it's a lab, but they're basing their findings on a famous copper researcher out of Russia, Dr. Vasiliev. And the guy is a genius. He's an absolute genius. And I think it would be fun for the listener to realize that Mother Nature has our back. We were designed to be able to keep our body in regulation, keep our body in homeostasis. And this little known but critically important protein is the mechanism of homeostasis. And I just think it would be fun for people to familiarize themselves with what this protein is, what it does. It's unusual to see an article talk about multiple functions for ceruloplasmin, but that's the truth of it. Turns out there's 20 copper binding sites in the exon of the ceruloplasmin gene. That's a really big deal. That means that it's a very complicated genetic structure. And so I think people can get an appreciation for, like with that picture that you're just coming to, you can actually count the number of coppers in this protein. There's 6 of them. Originally, the people who discovered this, Holmberg and Laurel, back in 1948, they identified there was 8 coppers, and it was 8 for 30 years. And then it was 7 coppers for 30 years. And now, a generation later, it's 6. So no one's ever been able to explain to me what that's all about. But the important thing is there are many functions of ceruloplasmin. And I think if people are at all concerned about their iron status, they need to be more aware of the role of ceruloplasmin to regulate iron status. And that's where the glitch is in your system. And what I learned today, we didn't have a chance to talk about it, Jonathan. Maybe that'll be another conversation. But insulin affects the production of ceruloplasmin. And it's absolutely fascinating. And there are a lot of people who have sugar issues, as you know. There are a lot of people taking insulin. And that insulin is affecting the production of ceruloplasmin, which means there's a problem with iron regulation in their body. Well, what is sugar dysregulation? It's an iron issue. And so we've got this circular dynamic going on. And so all I'm trying to do in these conversations, and I'm very grateful to have this one with you today, is give people a deeper understanding of how beautifully designed our body is, but how abused it has been over our lifetime. I could go back 100 years, but certainly within our lifetime, there have been so many changes in farming, changes in food processing, changes in the environment, just what we're exposed to on a daily basis, and then, of course, the changes in pharmaceuticals. Well, those changes have a cumulative effect on our physiology. And I think people need to know that we're not broken, but we are out of balance. And this protein, the ceruloplasmin protein, is the mechanism that we were endowed with to stay in balance and maintain our physiology. And it's just, I think it's an amazing element that not enough people know about. And I think if more people did know about it, they would be asking different questions of their practitioner, and they would be demanding better answers from their practitioner to really understand, well, isn't this at the base of the problem? And it is. And that's really what my book was about. Cure Your Fatigue was about helping people realize that making more of this protein is going to, in the long run, help them make more energy.
Well, thank you for that paper. We'll post it in the show notes. And if you haven't read Morley's book, do that. That's important. You also have a supplement called Recuperate, which is what it sounds like, but it's a copper-focused supplement. And also your website and other contact info. What's a good way for people to learn more about you? Root Cause Protocol.
The website is rcp123.org, RCP for Root Cause Protocol. We have a resources tab that will get you to the RCP handbook. There are 81 posts on iron toxicity. If you're a reader, you'll have plenty to read. If you're a listener, there's probably 150. I've got over 200, but I think we only have about 150 podcast interviews that are identified in that resources section. We have an RCP community. You can become part of that, where you're actively involved in meetings and asking questions in online activity. And then, of course, we're now enrolling for our institute, the RCP Institute, which will start. The classes will start in, I think it's February 9th of 2024, assuming we're all here then. But we're gearing up, and the class is filling nicely, and we're very excited about This will be group number 19, but people should look into that and think seriously. If they really want to get command of their health, get command of their physiology, this is a great place to start. And then if you just want social media, we have Facebook, Instagram are the two principal places where we hang out. And then for those who want to reach out to me personally, my email address is my first and last name on the screen, morleyrobbins@gmail.com. And for the brave few that want to call me, 847-922-8061. And I give my number out because sometimes people just need to have a conversation. And I'm honored to do that. And I'm fortunate that I'm not overwhelmed, thank God. But for those people that do need to have that chat, I'm more than looking forward to that.